Hello everyone. Last time we were together, we were talking about the Industrial Revolution and the changes that came about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Well, now we're going to look at the impact of that by looking at development. So let's get started. Now, the first thing that we have to do when we talk about development is we have to go ahead and define a couple of terms. First off, what is development? Here's our definition, and as always, you're going to go ahead and underline the important parts of this definition. It is the process of improvement in the material conditions of people through the diffusion of knowledge and technology. And that could be the same kind of knowledge and technology that we talked about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about improvement in people's lives, improving the material conditions of people. And so that's what the Industrial Revolution did, is it improved people's lives. But as we pointed out last time, did the Industrial Revolution happen everywhere at the same time? No, it didn't. So what ended up happening is that as the Industrial Revolution progressed and diffused, there was a gap that was created between countries that had industrialized and countries that hadn't. And so now we had a gap between countries where prior to this, throughout all of human history, there wasn't nearly the same kind of gap. Yes, we had places that were more developed or less developed, but not to the scale, not to the extent that we're going to see now after the Industrial Revolution, which is why it is such a huge event as far as human history is concerned. Huge event. So, now we have countries that are more developed and less developed, and those are MDCs and LDCs. Now, these are terms that we are going to want to know for the remainder of the school year. MDCs, LDCs. And you're going to see some variations on it, but here are our definitions. More developed country, MDC, a country that has progressed relatively far along a continuum of development. So they are relatively developed. And in fact, that's an alternative name that you may hear for MDCs, is relatively developed or core or just plain developed. Country is developed. So make sure that you know those alternative names: MDC, core, relatively developed, or just developed. And then we have LDCs, less developed countries. And that is a country that is at a relatively early stage in the process of economic development. And alternative names that we might hear for that are periphery or developing. Now, a term that you might have popped in your head is this that first world, second world, third world classification system? And to be perfectly honest, the answer is no. Now, that's what those terms have come to mean, is that a first world country is a country that's very developed and a third world country is a country that isn't. But that's not really how those terms originated. In fact, a first world country, these terms come from the Cold War, at a time when the United States and then the Soviet Union, what is now Russia and several of its surrounding countries, were at odds, or a war. And the first world were countries that were allied with the United States. Right? And these were largely democratic countries and things like that. And the second world were countries that were allied with the Soviet Union, with Russia. And these were largely communist countries, all right, and under the communist sphere of influence. And the third world was everyone else. Now, you'll notice that these were political terms, not developmental, which is why we don't use these terms in this class. And so again, we're providing you alternative phrases to use in place of that. Now, you might have heard first world, second world, third world, but now we're going to be using terms like MDC or LDC, core or periphery. So we'll use those types of vocabulary moving forward. Now that we've talked about differences in levels of development, let's talk about how we can examine this spatially. And we start with the Brandt line. Now, the Brandt line was a line that was drawn across the entire planet as part of this Brandt report that was produced in the 1980s. And you can probably guess the name of the guy that produced the Brandt report. His name was John Smith. I'm just kidding, it was Brandt. His name was Willy Brandt. He was actually the Chancellor of West Germany during the Cold War. So again, that comes into play here. But essentially what the Brandt report did was draw this Brandt line. And it was also known as the North-South divide, and essentially said that more developed countries were north of the Brandt line and less developed countries were south of the Brandt line. So you can see it here in a couple major notes of division. So the Brandt line runs between the United States and Mexico through the Mediterranean Sea along the southern border of what was at that time the Soviet Union. So you had Russia along with those Central Asian Soviet republics, what are now former Soviet republics, north of Mongolia and China. Now here's where things get a little kind of crazy, is that it actually runs in between Japan and the Korean Peninsula, between Japan and China, around Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, north of Australia, and then around. So essentially what they did was say that Japan, Australia, New Zealand were north of the Brandt line, despite geographically technically being south of where it was being drawn. So that gets a little bit confusing at times, all right? But you just want to kind of remember that it was a division between north and south. North was more developed, south was less developed. Now, for this slide, I really want to add some emphasis. Please put a huge star next to this slide in your notes, because what this slide did was include the Brandt line, but in addition to that, include a lot of the other things that we're going to talk about over the course of the year, some of which we've already talked about. Notice that north of the Brandt line, what we call MDCs, more developed countries, or in this case they call them MEDCs, more economically developed countries, they have the employment structure of that country. Most people are in the tertiary sector and a smaller are in the secondary and primary sector. And then flip that south of the line, most people are working in the primary sector, smaller in the secondary and tertiary sectors. All right. In addition to that, they also have classifications for urban and rural. They have what we're going to look at as population pyramids. They call them age-sex pyramids on here. In addition to that, a bunch of other statistics: high gross national product for MEDCs, low birth and death rates, high levels of literacy, all these different things that we're going to talk about over the course of the year when it comes to development. So put a big star next to this, because this is going to be a great review tool when it comes time for the AP exam. Our textbook has a variation of the Brandt line, but there is especially one notable difference. Can you identify what that notable difference is? If you need to, go back and look at the last two slides. Take a look at where the Brandt line was. Notice what's north and south of that Brandt line. And I want to see if you can catch the difference. Which one jumped to the other side of the line here? Hopefully at this point you've noticed that those Central Asian former Soviet republics that had been north of the Brandt line are now south. So this is a modified Brandt line, and we'll talk about why that would be in a little bit. But there's one thing I want to ask you when it comes to this slide in the Brandt line. Do you think that we can classify development simply by two classes, more and less? Do you think it's the best way to classify? Let's say, for example, can we classify into haves and have-nots? Is it that black and white? To put it another way, to bring it back to a little bit of mapping, this is kind of like a choropleth map with only two classes: developed and developing. Is a two-class choropleth map going to be that helpful for us? In this case, we can be more specific. And so that's what we're going to look at next. Next, we have Immanuel Wallerstein's World Systems Theory. And in this case, this takes the Brandt line, okay, doing more developed and less developed, and becomes more specific than that. So in this case, it's not just more and less. Now we have 3 classes. And so on your notes, make sure you know what those 3 classes are called. We have the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. And we can apply this in a variety of different ways. We're talking about it now in terms of economics, but we are going to also look at it in terms of political later this year. And so in this case, when we talk about economic development later, we're going to talk also about how countries that are underdeveloped, countries that are still developing, what we call the periphery in Wallerstein's World Systems Theory, are largely dependent on the core countries. And we're going to talk about why that is, and we're going to talk about international trade. So for right now, just know that we are going to come back to this. We are going to look at this in a lot more detail as we go on. So right now, we're just introducing this. But we can spatially examine this. In much the same way that we could spatially examine the Brandt line, we can spatially examine world systems theory. So what we have here is a polar projection. Please make sure that you include this in your notes. This is a polar projection. All right. It is an azimuthal or planar projection centered on, in this case, the North Pole. Now, what you can see here is that we can still see that modified Brandt line from our textbook. All right, we still have that north-south divide. But now, the reason that we're looking at it from a polar projection is so that we can understand why the terms core and periphery were used. Take a look. The countries that are near the middle are the core. Think about it in this way. Think about an apple core. Where's the apple core located? Yeah, it's in the middle of the apple. And so the core countries on a polar projection are near the center. And the periphery is the outside. And so those are the countries that are less developed, so LDCs, all right? And periphery just means the kind of the sides, the edges. Has anyone ever told you, like, use your peripheral vision? It's always kind of like this conversation, like, look over there, but don't really look over there. Use your peripheral vision. And you kind of look out of the side of your eye. That's what we're talking about. These are the edges of the map on a polar projection. So that's what we're looking at. Now, we can talk about some examples. So here are examples of core and periphery countries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a list of examples, but I want you to be thinking, what countries do you think are going to be on here? In addition to that, let's add some countries. I want you to add your own examples because we're going to double check that in a few minutes when we take a look at the map. So here are a couple of our countries that fit with the core designation. The United States is part of the core, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Germany, France, Canada, all part of the core as far as individual countries are concerned. Now, we can also identify regions that are part of the core. And I identified 2 of them, North America and Western Europe. Now, taking a look at this list, is there anything we can add to this? Are there countries that you would add to the list of core countries? Go ahead and add those, please. Next, let's take a look at countries that are part of the periphery. All right. Now, I decided to kind of spread this out all over the world. Countries that would be part of the periphery in different regions, multiple regions. So we have Guatemala, we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, North Korea, Afghanistan, all countries that would be classified as part of the periphery. Now, we can also talk about regions when it comes to the periphery. However, there's really one region that kind of stands alone as being almost universally part of the periphery, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. And so when we take a look at levels of development, a lot of times we will be comparing the very top with the very bottom so that we can see the division in between. And not so that we can cast judgment or do anything like that, but more so that we can understand why is it like that. And then we'll look for those subtle nuances in the middle. Speaking of the middle, Wallerstein's theory had 3 designations. Yes, we had core and periphery, the more developed and the less, but what about the middle? That's what the semi-periphery is all about. So over time, the semi-periphery has grown quite dramatically. All right, the periphery is actually significantly smaller now. Levels of development have been increasing dramatically over time. So the semi-periphery has grown quite a bit. And the reality is that the semi-periphery is going to have characteristics of both the core and the periphery. Now, let's take a look at a couple examples that fit with the semi-periphery. Now, whenever you think of the semi-periphery, I always want you to start with the BRIC countries. That is B-R-I-C. Now, this term originally came from Goldman Sachs in terms of identifying economic growth and things like that. But for us, it kind of fits with what we're talking about. Economic growth is really just improving development. So these BRIC countries were countries that were identified as having rapid economic growth and, in this case, rapid development, so moving into that semi-periphery. Those countries are Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And so whenever you have to come up with an example of the semi-periphery, I want you to always start here. Always start with BRIC. Now there are other countries that would fit into the semi-periphery as well. Argentina is a really good example. In fact, Argentina is, I would say, one of the most developed countries that is south of the Brant line. This is probably one of the most developed countries that is technically, according to the Brant report, a less developed country. Which is why the Brant report isn't ideal for our purposes, because it's too black and white. And we know that the world is going to be different shades of gray somewhere in between. And Argentina is a great example of that. South Africa is a really good example. So on the last slide, we said that sub-Saharan Africa is one of the least developed regions on Earth, but South Africa stands out as a noticeable difference. South Korea is another good example. Now, there was an interesting article a few years ago that asked, the title was, "Is Mint the New BRIC?" And they were trying to determine, are these Mint countries going to follow the same path as the BRIC countries? So we know that BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, China. The Mint countries are Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. So on this next slide, we're going to double check your examples, and we're going to try to answer the question, is Mint the new BRIC? So here we go. This is an image looking at economic development across the world, looking at core, periphery, and semi-periphery. Core is our orange, semi-periphery our yellow, and periphery is our green. So first off, let's ask the questions we're used to asking. First off, what type of map are we looking at? Next, at what scale? And hopefully you notice that this is once again a choropleth map at the national scale. Now, I asked you to come up with some examples of countries that are part of the core, part of the periphery, and semi-periphery. And let's double check those. The countries you came up with, are they where you thought they would be? And if not, maybe start to wonder, okay, why might that be? Because again, A lot of times in this class, it's not about getting it right or wrong, but understanding why is it that way. So let's try to answer the question of, is mint the new brick? Now you might have to pull out a map in order to determine where some of these countries are, but this is the way that we practice place name geography, so let's take a look. Mint, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey. So according to this image, Mexico is part of the semi-periphery along with Turkey, whereas Indonesia and Nigeria are not. So to answer the question, at least using this image, is mint the new brick? We'd have to say not quite there yet. Mexico and Turkey in the same class as Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Nigeria and Turkey not yet there. But then we could look at some other information as well to help us out. Our next measure of development that we're going to look at is the Human Development Index. Now this is one of our vocabulary terms, so as always, let's go ahead and underline key parts of our definitions. So here we go. The Human Development Index, or HDI, is an indicator of the level of development for each country constructed by the United Nations, combining income, literacy, education, and life expectancy. Now, this was something that was created by the United Nations, the UN, in the early 90s, and it was an attempt to try and examine development in terms of people instead of economics. And so it looked at more than just dollars and cents or money or currency to measure level of development. So, in the case of the Human Development Index, there are 3 dimensions. Each dimension has at least one indicator, and one of those dimensions, education, has 2 indicators. Now, I do want to make a note here that these are the new indicators for the Human Development Index. Please make that note, because here's the reality, that these indicators have changed recently to try and be more representative of differences in levels of development. We are going to discuss the old indicators on the off chance that you perhaps might see them. I don't think it's very likely. You certainly won't see it in my class because I'll always try and use information that is as up to date as possible. But I want to make sure that you're aware of the indicators of old and understand how they have changed to the new. So let's go through these. The health dimension has a single indicator, and that is life expectancy at birth. How long is a newborn baby expected to live? That's the health dimension. Our education dimension is an average of these 2 indicators. The first being expected years of schooling when you start. So when you start school, how long are you expected to go to school given the country that you are in and kind of the societal norms and things like that. And then the other indicator in the education dimension is average years of schooling measured at age 25. So standardized at age 25, how many years have you gone to school up to that point? Now, in order to give some context to this, let's talk about it in the sense of the United States. So first off, what do you think is the expectation here in the United States as far as schooling? Is the expectation K through 12? That would be 13 years. The expectation in the United States, according to the most recent HDI numbers, is actually 16.5 years. So the expectation goes beyond the 13 years of K-12 and into some higher level of education. Now we compare that with the average years of schooling. Now, do you think the average years of schooling are the same as the expected years of schooling? And hopefully you said, even though the expectation is set at 16 and a half, that we're typically not going to reach that. Yes, some people are going to go beyond 16 and a half. Other people aren't going to quite get there. So the average actually ends up being a little bit lower. And the average in the United States is 12.9 years, which is almost full K-12, which would be 13. Our average at age 25 is 12.9 years of schooling. And so we average those two out in order to get the single education dimension, but realistically we actually see them in their own separate columns. And then finally, we have living standards. And living standards is just going to be measured by gross national income per capita. It should be noted on here that it is not gross domestic product. Now, we'll talk about those differences later, but the reason that I add that caveat is that it's not GDP, because it used to be GDP. It has now changed. It is now GNI per capita. GNI stands for gross national income. And per capita just means per person, basically. So now, I told you guys that we would mention the old indicators as well. All right. Still were 4. Some of them remain the same, even now. For example, life expectancy is still the same. And one of the education indicators used to just be amount of education. And so we still see that represented here, just in expected years of schooling and average years of schooling. Now, the two indicators that are quite different on the old indicators were literacy rate, which was also part of education, and GDP per capita. And the difference is that GNI measures not only what we produce within a country, but also money that flows from other countries into ours. So money that comes into the United States from abroad because of US companies. And that is a more accurate representation of economic growth given the current globalized economy that we are living in. GDP doesn't measure money that comes in from outside of the country. It's just what is produced within a country. Now in this image, this just shows the 3 dimensions and 4 indicators of the Human Development Index in kind of a visual setting. Again, point out we have life expectancy at birth, average years of schooling, expected years of schooling, and if you didn't write it down on the last slide, GNI per capita is gross national income per capita, right? All of those are combined to give us the Human Development Index. And in much the same way that spatially we could see the Brandt line, spatially we could see the world systems theory from Wallerstein, we can spatially see the Human Development Index. So what we have here is a map that shows the Human Development Index. Let's ask the questions that we typically ask. What type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing this? Once again, choropleth and national scale. Now, the additional question I want to ask, and this is going to be a question that shows up throughout the entire year, is this. And please write this down. Is this a good indicator of development? And by that I mean, is the Human Development Index a good indicator of development? Now, how do you determine that? And the thing that I want you to look at is there a clear divide between the countries that we know are very developed and the regions that we know are very developed and the regions that we know are very underdeveloped or very low on the development scale? And that's why we identified those regions at the 2 extremes. All right, we identified regions that were at the very developed end. We said North America, Western Europe. We could go further and say regions like Oceania, Australia and New Zealand, as well as like Japan. Now, what region did we say was at the low end of the spectrum? We said there was one region that was clearly part of the periphery, and that region was Sub-Saharan Africa. So when you look at this image, is there a clear divide between the regions at the very top of the spectrum and the regions at the very bottom? And in this case, yes, there is. There is a very clear divide between regions at the top and regions at the bottom. And what that means is that the Human Development Index is a good indicator of development. And it should be, because that's what it's attempting to do. It is a human development index. So we expect that it would measure development well. And when we look at it, it most certainly does. Are there variations? Of course, but that's the important part that we go in and look more in depth at. We start with generalizations and then we get more detail. So let's get more detailed. This looks at the Human Development Index by region. Now, to point out a couple of things, a couple of these are countries instead of regions, though that is still technically a region. It's a formal region, but a little bit different than some of what we're looking at here. Now, this information comes from your textbook. And what I would like you to do is just take a look at it and identify, is there anything that kind of catches your attention? Is there anything that jumps out at you? Maybe circle what jumps out at you. What catches your attention as like, wow, that's really high, or wow, that's really low? What do you think that would be? What kind of jumps out at you? Now, let's go through this and talk about a couple of things. First off, we divide it between MDCs and LDCs. Remember, MDCs were north of the Brant line, LDCs south of the Brant line. And in this case, our textbook is using that modified Brant line, where the Central Asian former Soviet republics are south of the Brant line. So once again, we ask the question, is the Brant line the best way to divide up differences in development? Is every country that's north of the Brant line clearly an MDC? And is every region or country below the Brant line clearly an LDC? And hopefully this reinforces why just two classes, two divisions, more and less, isn't the best way to do this. Once again, let's try and apply Wallerstein's core periphery model. Can you identify the regions that are part of the core? Draw a line. Where do you think that core ends and the semi-periphery begins? And then, can you draw a line where the semi-periphery ends and the periphery begins? Now make sure that you're labeling this, not just drawing lines and leaving it. Make sure that you draw the line and label it. These are the core regions. These are the semi-periphery. These are the periphery. So make sure that you do this, because again, we're applying this on a variety of scales. Now we have three different ways to spatially examine this. We have the Brant line, more and less. We have the World Systems Theory by Emanuel Wallerstein. We have core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And then we also have the Human Development Index, which looks at individual countries. Now, the last thing that we're going to look at tonight is the trend data when it comes to the Human Development Index. And in this case, we're looking at a period of 40 years. Now, the image on the right is actually a graph. I know it kind of looks like your little brother or sister stole a bunch of crayons and started scribbling on the wall. But it's actually a graph showing development data over a period of 40 years. Now, I kind of broke this down for you guys. And so what we have is that the regions that are growing the fastest are areas in East Asia and the Pacific, followed by South Asia, and then countries in the Arabian Peninsula, Arab states. All right. Now, out of the 135 countries that were examined in this case between this 40-year period, all but 3 improved. There were only 3 that did not improve their level of human development between 1970 and 2010. And those 3 exceptions are the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And what region are all 3 of those countries a part of? And the answer is Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, it's really important that not only do we identify the countries that are or the regions that are improving very quickly, but we also identify areas that aren't improving or are improving slowly. Because the reality is this, that the areas that are more developed, the areas that are developing rapidly, the areas that are less developed, all have different challenges facing them, all have different characteristics, all have different challenges facing them. And so we have to understand these differences in levels of development in order to examine everything that we're going to look at for the remainder of the year. And so I will leave you with that for this evening. Have a wonderful night, and we'll continue talking about this in class. Goodbye.